Hello and welcome to the Winneshiek Energy District's July Energy Lunch and Learn. Today is energy efficient cooling and heating with heat pumps with energy planner Paul Cutting. My name's Kristen Egan, Executive Director here at the Winneshiek Energy District, and I'll be your host today. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen. Great to be here.
Paul, how often do people ask you about heat pumps when they have home energy questions?
A lot. It seems like a lot of the direction is towards solar and most recently heat pumps. So many conversations we have about them.
Well, thanks for helping us understand a little bit more about them. I'm really excited to dive in. Before
Great.
we do, I just want to share with folks that you have a background in teaching and carpentry, and now you work as our energy planner here at the Winneshiek Energy District out of Decorah, and the technical lead for the Clean Energy Districts of Iowa Association. Not to mention that you recently installed your own heat pump in your small teardrop trailer. So we're talking to the right person who knows how this can easily be integrated into any home or maybe even not a home, maybe a mobile unit as well. So thank you for spending time with us here today. And let's just jump in. What do you have to tell us?
Sounds good. Thanks, Kristen. So heat pumps. Kind of the premise behind a heat pump is, or the thing that people need to understand, that the general concept is that heat pumps move heat as opposed to creating heat. And as a result, they have efficiencies that are really high and that are greater than 100%. So when you think of a regular gas furnace or baseboard electric heat, what you're doing is you're essentially taking a unit of fuel and then you either burn that unit of fuel or you run it through a resistance element and you get a unit of heat on the outside of it or on the output side of it. With a heat pump, since you're not actually creating anything, you're simply moving energy from one location to another. Your efficiency can be greater than 1 to 1. So with an air source heat pump where you're using the outside air as the medium that you're extracting heat from and dumping heat into, you can achieve efficiencies of anywhere from 2 to 4 units for every unit that you input. There are other types of heat pumps. A ground source heat pump, which uses the ground as a reservoir to draw energy from and to dump energy into, has a higher efficiency. With a ground source heat pump, you might get 4 or 6 units of heat or cooling with 1 unit of energy input. So that's kind of the goal with a heat pump. The other important concept to understand with a heat pump is that heat pumps allow for decarbonization. Kind of the easiest pathway to get toward lessening of reliance on fossil fuels for both space heating and space cooling is to use electricity as opposed to using natural gas. So when you're talking heat pumps, air source heat pumps, your ability to extract heat from or dump heat into the outside environment is relative or relational to the outdoor air temperature. So here in the upper Midwest, we have a really cold climate. And in the dead of winter, when you're trying to extract heat from the outside air, your ability to do that gets less and less the colder outside it is. So as a result, your efficiency goes down the colder it is outside. Why that's important. Electricity tends to be expensive, whereas other fuel types, namely natural gas, propane, they tend to be cheaper. So since your efficiencies are greater than 100%, your ability to compete on cost with those other types of fuels becomes more challenging the colder it is outside.
Okay, I'm going to
So
pause you because I have some questions
yeah,
already. You mentioned ground source heat pumps being super efficient. Now, when you
yep,
described it, it sounded a lot to me like geothermal. Are they the same things or related?
yep. A ground source heat pump is geothermal. Yep.
Okay, that's good to know. And then the other question I had was you said that a heat pump moves heat, it doesn't create it. So if it's 17 degrees outside, what heat is it moving into my home or how does that work? Because I
So
don't want my home
essentially,
to be 17 degrees.
sure. So it's doing that using compression and a refrigerant. So boy, way back when when I taught high school, the refrigerant cycle was a ninth grade physical science concept. I get lost in the details of it, but essentially what you're doing is you're taking refrigerant, which is a gas essentially, or a vapor, depending on what state it's in, and you're either compressing it or to essentially move the energy to extract heat from the outside and to draw that heat into the building when you're trying to heat. And then in the summer months, when you're trying to cool with your heat pump, you're essentially taking the heat that's inside the building and you're dumping it into the outside environment. So that process happens by way of a refrigerant coupled with a compressor to compress that refrigerant to change its state.
Wow. So it's a relatively simple technology, but is
Yeah,
just starting to be more
very
widely
simple.
used, it sounds like.
Yeah, so heat pumps have been in existence for well over 100 years. It's just the technology to make it more efficient and to be able to get it to the point where we're able to get meaningful heating and cooling has increased and has improved like greatly over the last decade or so.
Amazing.
So when you're looking at heat pumps versus other fuel types, it's important to keep in mind that generally speaking, electricity is really expensive. Um, so there's a lot going on this chart right here. Um, but essentially the main takeaways are that electric resistance heat, when I say electric resistance, you're essentially using an electric resistance element to produce heat. So think of a hair dryer or a toaster. That tends to be really expensive to produce heat that way. And an electric resistance element has an efficiency of 100%, whereas a heat pump has an efficiency of maybe 300 or 400%, meaning your costs of operation are going to be 3 to 4 times less than electric resistance. So on the chart right here, what I've done is I've kind of broken it down based on your electric provider. So our local utility here is Alliant. Whereas out in the country, if you live out in the country, you're going to be served by a rural electric co-op. Generally speaking, rural electric co-ops have lower rates. So as a result, heat pumps become more cost competitive. Um, so on the third bar right here where it says Alliant and then ASHP, ASHP stands for air source heat pump. So to produce 100,000 BTUs of heat, you're going to pay $1.99 in electricity. Most Alliant customers also have access to natural gas. So if you follow the orange line over to natural gas, you'll notice that also to produce 100,000 BTUs of heat, it's going to only cost you 96 cents. So it's about twice as expensive to run an air source heat pump than it is natural gas. For those who are out in
Sure.
the
So can
country,
I ask a question? So
yeah,
so in other words, just to make sure, this would cost you more to do this super efficient thing if so if your goal was to not pay as much for your bills, this wouldn't be as good of an option for natural gas customers. But if your goal was to electrify and decarbonize your home, it might be worth considering. Is that what you're saying?
yes, yep. And then we'll
Okay.
take that a step farther on the next slide. So we'll talk about the idea of kind of coupling the two together to get the benefits of both cost savings and carbon reductions by coupling a heat pump with a gas furnace.
Okay. Awesome.
Um, yep. So then on the blue line here, you'll notice where it says REC ASHP. So that's the Rural Electric Co-op air source heat pump. So based on their rates, and it's going to cost you about $1.34 to produce 100,000 BTUs of heat. Most REC customers don't have access to natural gas, so they're only able to use propane. So if you want to produce the same amount of heat, it's going to cost you more with propane than it would be to use electricity with a heat pump. So for rural customers, heat pumps definitely make a lot of sense. Now, I mentioned the idea of a dual fuel setup where essentially coupling a heat pump with a natural gas furnace. We know that the efficiency is greater the warmer the outside air is. So, so what the blue lines here represent on the graph, this is the whole heating season broken down by the amount of time spent at each degree when it's outside. So for example, where I drew that vertical line at 25 degrees, if you were to follow that up, that means that you're going to expend, when it's 25 degrees over the course of the whole heating season, you're going to expend a certain amount of energy. Um, so when you take an air source heat pump and essentially only utilize it when it's that temperature and greater, you're still able to capture a lot of the heating requirements of the heating season. So when you're able to use your heat pump during those times, you're going to see CO2 reductions, and you're going to see potentially cost savings as well because the heat pump is more able to compete with natural gas. Below that vertical, or to the left of that vertical red line, would be the point at which you might potentially then use your gas furnace instead, because the gas furnace is going to be more cost advantageous to do so. Um, so dual fuel setups, what are kind of the benefits? Like, why would you go in that direction? Number one, with a dual fuel setup, you're able to maximize savings. So you're just using the heat pump when it makes financial sense to do so. Number two, you're able to see CO2 reductions because through electrification, you see CO2 savings. Um, Generally speaking, with heat pumps, they're better able to match loads than our conventional gas furnaces. So you're going to see better indoor air quality, more comfort, more ability to stay closer to what the set temperature is on your thermostat. Number four, your ability to maximize incentives, both tax credits and rebates. And then number five, kind of an unspoken benefit that will probably come more into play the farther we get along in the electric transition, is that with utilizing a dual fuel heat pump, you might not actually contribute to wintertime stresses on the grid, because as people electrify transportation, as water and space heating become electrified, we're going to see increased utility spikes or utility peaks of what the load is in the dead of winter, and being able to minimize those peaks is going to be to everyone's advantage.
Sounds like there's a lot of good reasons to consider a dual fuel.
Mhm. So with the dual fuel heat pump, a few of the little basics. This is a top level conversation, very broad. We're just trying to give you the general outlines of what you might consider. Roughly 80% of houses have furnaces with ductwork. So to come up with a solution that fits within those parameters is really important. So one thing you might consider if you have an existing furnace is to essentially retain your existing furnace and then basically replace the coil, the air conditioning coil that sits on top of that furnace, and replace the central air conditioner that sits outside. Replacing both of those with a heat pump version gives you then the ability to space heat with the heat pump. Um, Another benefit is that generally speaking, if your furnace is relatively new, you're able to keep the furnace. So instead of having to upgrade three pieces of equipment, the indoor furnace, the coil that sits on top of it, and the outside air conditioner, you're then only having to upgrade the coil that sits on top of the furnace and the outdoor air conditioner, and replacing those two portions with a heat pump. So kind of how this works is that you basically set the point or the outside temperature at which the heat pump is going to kick on. So you could say, okay, when it's 20 degrees and greater, I'm going to rely on the heat pump, and the thermostat knows to activate the heat pump when it's above those temperatures. And then anything below that point, the gas furnace is going to run exclusively. And that's user defined. So you can set that based on what fuel prices are. And then the last point on here, I make a note of single stage versus dual stage versus inverter driven. Essentially, heat pumps, they're able to modulate or meet the load, meaning that depending on the outdoor conditions, the number of BTUs that are required to heat your house are variable. They go up and down. Most equipment kind of runs at either 100% on or it's off. Whereas with a heat pump, it's able to match that load and kind of run and ramp up and down based on what the heating or cooling requirements are. With a dual fuel setup, that type of heat pump isn't always required, meaning that you can get by with a more simple and more cost-effective heat pump, either a single stage unit or a dual stage unit. And then what I note here in italics down at the bottom, it says a decent dual stage heat pump shouldn't cost much more, if any more, than a comparable new dual stage air conditioning unit. So this doesn't have to be an incredibly expensive upgrade.
This seems like a great option, especially if you're thinking right now, like, wow, shoot, I just upgraded my furnace. I don't want to have to
Yes.
invest in a whole new thing, even if it does meet some of my maybe carbon reduction goals or whatnot. This, yeah, seems like a great option. And a question that came up for me, you mentioned this as a great opportunity for people who are on natural gas who want to take maybe advantage of the energy savings, like monetary savings there. Do they have dual fuel that are available for propane customers or a propane dual fuel setup as well? And yeah, tell us about that.
Yep, yep. So there'd be no difference in the equipment. So you can couple a dual fuel heat pump with a propane furnace, with a fuel oil. No one really uses fuel oil anymore, but yeah, it's all universal. Yep.
Sure. Which, granted, the propane, like you had mentioned, is more costly than the electricity. So it sounds like maybe price wise, might it might not be as inexpensive as just going all electric. Is that accurate? If you did a propane dual fuel?
In certain situations, like so, for example, if you had a really small house and a house that's new and really tight, an all electric option is probably your best bet. Whereas if you have a larger, older or leaky house, being able to utilize propane, even in really cold temperatures, is probably going to be to your advantage just because the heating loads are so high. And that with an air source heat pump, the colder it gets outside, the less heat it can provide, and the more costly it is to do that at those temperatures. So even though propane is more expensive, it's more cost advantageous to use a dual fuel setup and still use the propane at colder temperatures.
Got it.
So the next option is a mini split or dockless system. This is great for people who currently use electric resistance or baseboard heat, or if you've got steam or hot water heat. It's very flexible. You can do it room by room if you wanted to, kind of add to it over time. They're what we call single zone units, where you have one outdoor unit paired to an indoor unit. So you got a wall hanging unit. There are also multi-zone units, and depending on what equipment you select, sometimes you can pair up to 8 indoor units to one outdoor unit. So you're not having to put all these outdoor units all around your house. You can just have one outdoor unit that serves a whole bunch of them inside. Generally speaking, though, ductless tends to be more expensive and it's more complicated compared to a ducted heat pump where you're simply swapping out the coil that sits on top of the furnace or potentially the whole furnace. There are fewer parts with a ducted heat pump versus a mini split system where you have refrigerant lines serving every single unit. And then finally, what you were asking about earlier, Kristen, um, you got a centrally ducted system without a gas furnace backup. This is a great option for those who have new construction. So like any new house right now, this is how they should be being built. Not like there's no reason to have natural gas in a new construction of like basically of any size, given that new houses are so incredibly tight and the heating and cooling loads are so small. A heat pump is great in any situation with new construction. Um, and an all electric option might potentially make sense for those who are in really tight houses, like I said, or small houses when you're also a propane customer. So in this type of setup, essentially you don't have a gas furnace. The indoor unit kind of becomes the blower motor. The whole indoor air handler unit is combined rather than having the natural gas furnace or the propane furnace with the coil that sits on top. It's kind of all integrated into one. Um, and oftentimes the cost of this type of equipment tends to be quite low Um, so this is going to be significantly less expensive than a dual fuel option if you were to replace both the furnace and the heat pump portion.
That was what
So how
I
much are we
was just
talking?
wondering. How
Costs
much are
are,
we talking?
yeah. So it's highly variable depending on your situation, depending on the market you're operating in, how many contractors are operating. Are they selling lots of these units? Do they view it more as kind of a niche thing? Are they risk averse to this technology? Are they not familiar with it? Therefore, they feel they kind of don't want to go out on a limb and promoting it. There are a whole bunch of factors that go into play. Um, so kind of what I see around here, a conventional gas furnace might run you 5,000 to 6,500. Conventional lower efficiency central air conditioner is probably going to be about another $5,000 on top of that. Um, Instead of the air conditioning, if you were to opt for an inverter driven heat pump instead, you're probably looking at $7,000 to $10,000. Um, Fortunately, there are incentives to make up the difference. So ideally, the cost of upgrading to the heat pump won't add significantly to the project. And then finally, regarding ductless, kind of cost wise, what I'm seeing around here is $4,000 to $4,500 per indoor unit. So if you've got a house that requires, for example, 5 indoor units, you're maybe talking $15,000 to $18,000 in that situation. So ductless tends to be more expensive, generally speaking.
I do remember
Um,
you saying though that they heat and they cool. So that
they do.
listeners might just keep that in their mind that installing a heat pump is both a heating and cooling device. So think of it as your furnace and your AC cost together. Unless you're going dual fuel, in which case you would still need a furnace.
Yep. Yep. So then, when accounting for the various incentives, replacing essential air conditioning with a heat pump capable of providing meaningful heat. So when I say meaningful, I'm not necessarily talking about being able to heat when it's 20 below zero out. I'm kind of talking about dual fuel where you're going to utilize the heat pump at a certain temperature and above. Shouldn't cost more than replacing a conventional air conditioner. That's great. So what are the incentives? The first one is a federal tax credit, so it's valued at 30% up to $2,000. The credit can be taken annually, so if you're like installing ductless, for example, you could do one project one year, you could do another project the next year. The tax credit is available for both space heating and cooling and water heating. So there are heat pumps that you can use for water heating. This $2,000 tax credit can be used for that type of heat pump as well. Um, and then just kind of an FYI, the federal government does provide a tax credit for central air conditioners. The value of that tax credit is only $600 though. So tax credits worth up to potentially $2,000. Um, the other rebate potentially available are through your local utility. Here in Alliant territory, uh, heat pump is only worth $300, unfortunately. It doesn't mean much. $300 on a $10,000 project is not meaningful, in my opinion. Um, if you're out in the country in REC territory, most of them are providing very generous rebates. So, for example, the two local RECs here provide rebates of $300 a ton. So when I say ton, I'm talking about 12,000 BTUs of capacity. So most homes require 3 to 5 tons. It varies, of course. So meaning that you might get $900 to $1,500 back. For those of we're right on the border. For those who are in Minnesota, the incentives are even greater. Um, there's usually utility rebates available that are about $2,000 for a project. And then this last year, the state of Minnesota authorized a pilot project for the state to provide a state level rebate that's aligned with the upcoming IRA rebates. And that rebate is valued up to $4,000. So potentially just at the rebate level for those who are in Minnesota, you could get $6,000 back. And then finally, coupling The tax credits with the utility rebates are the upcoming IRA rebates of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed 2 years ago. Iowa's rebate, we hope, will be coming sometime the first part of 2025. Um, there are a lot of rules still to be written and figured out. We don't know exactly what the parameters are, but generally speaking, there's certain categories. So for space heating, heat pumps, there's a category allocation for up to $8,000 per household. These rebates are income qualifying. They're quite generous. So there are two thresholds. The more generous threshold is for those who are 80% of area median income and lower, which in Winneshiek County is about $54,000 for a household of two. This program will pay 100% of project costs up to $8,000. Um, for those who are between 80% and 150% of area median income, the program will pay for up to $8,000 of expenses, but will only pay 50% of project costs. The nice part about this rebate is you can stack it with the federal tax credit and the utility rebates. So you could maybe potentially get $8,000 rebate here. You, depending on your location, could get $1,500 or $2,000 in utility rebates, and then the tax credit. So potentially you're looking at significant money off the cost of a system. And then finally, the thing to note here for dual fuel configurations, we know for sure that the rebate will pay for the heat pump portion of things, but it won't pay for the gas furnace portion of things if you have to replace your gas furnace. So kind of my general takeaways here. Um, your situation varies from house to house. I make house visits all the time. One house looks totally different than another house based on age, based on size, condition, access to certain fuels. It varies greatly depending on what it is your house looks like. So generally speaking, for natural gas customers, dual fuel is the way to go. For propane and REC customers, uh, heat pumps make a ton of sense, regardless whether they're dual fuel or all electric. Air source heat pumps are competitive with electric rates for REC customers and cost competitive to natural or to propane. Um, if you're building a new house, all electric is definitely the way to go. There's really no reason why you even have to consider natural gas in a new home. Heat pump technology has come so far. You can meet all the needs of your new home just using a heat pump. Variable capacity heat pumps provide constant, even heating, and great dehumidification. So comfort-wise, heat pumps are a huge step up from conventional gas equipment.
Can I ask?
Regarding yeah,
I was going to ask, what does variable capacity mean?
meaning that you're able to match load. So they're able to ramp up and down to meet that load and to basically flex to whatever the heating or cooling requirements are,
Okay.
rather than just turning on, reaching the set point, shutting off, turning on again once the set point isn't reached, reaching the set point, turning off. And if you look at kind of the indoor temperature, you see these big swings above and below what your indoor thermometer or what your indoor thermostat set temperature is. And as a result, you don't get good dehumidification in the summer with cooling, because you don't get even airflow across the coil to basically extract humidity out of the outside air or out of the indoor air.
Sure. So if you do have a dual fuel and your heat pump is in your basement by your furnace, that could help dehumidify your basement?
Uh, No, it's dehumidifying all the return air. So in a forced air
Sure.
furnace, basically you have supply air and then you have an equal amount of air being distributed back into the furnace through the return. So any indoor air that's fed or any indoor return air that's fed over the coil is going to extract humidity from that or moisture from that air and then expel a lower humidity air on the supply side.
Okay. Okay.
Um, the IRA rebates won't last long, so if you're at all inclined to get in on this, acting fast once the rebates come out is definitely going to be to your advantage. And then finally, to put in a plug for the services we provide, I do home visits all the time. I talk to people constantly about heat pumps. If you have any questions, if you'd like me to stop out and look at your situation, what might work best for you, definitely reach out to us. Give us a call, shoot me an email, and we can definitely make that happen. And then on the final slide here, a few resources. Focus on Energy out of Wisconsin has a great heat pump buyer's guide. They kind of talk about all the general concepts that we covered here today more in depth. That's kind of my go-to resource for pointing people toward if they're at all inclined to think about a heat pump. The second resource on here is how dual fuel heat pump can compete with natural gas on both reducing emissions and dollar savings. And then finally, this is kind of a situational buyer's guide. Should I wait to buy a heat pump or should I do it now? Kind of talking about what are the different scenarios and what your situation is. Like, do you want to act now? Do you want to wait until the equipment fails? What does that look like for you? So definitely check out these three resources.
Wonderful. Paul,
That
thank you so much.
you're
This is
welcome.
a lot of good information. I know it's going to be helpful for a lot of residents in Winneshiek County and beyond to help them make decisions about their upcoming home upgrades and maybe now more strongly considering a heat pump. I do want to reiterate what you said that here at the Energy District, we have energy coaching services. So it's just energydistrict.org/services, and you'll find a link to energy coaching. You can sign up to have Paul come out to your place, or just sending a personal email would be great too. We are happy to help you navigate your next home energy upgrades and hope that you're considering a heat pump. I will put these links in the description of our YouTube video here. And so those will be available to folks. And also for anyone who registered for this energy lunch and learn, these slides will be available to you as well. If you would like these slides and you have not registered, you can just email us at contact@energydistrict.org. Paul, do you have anything else that you'd like to share about heat pumps before we sign off? Your favorite thing about them,
No.
perhaps?
Well, boy, my favorite thing. Oh, you put me on the spot. Oh boy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I don't know, Kristen. My favorite thing about heat pumps. Well, it's the plausible way to cut CO2 emissions. The technology works. It works in cold climates. It's cost competitive with other fuels. There's no reason to wait. The technology has come so far, and if you're at all inclined to move forward, now's the time to do it.
Well, that's perfect. On that note, we will sign off and stay tuned for the next Energy Lunch and Learn, which will be in September, the third Tuesday in September, at which point we will hear about Vesterheim's 1 year in review in their new energy efficient building. So get to hear all about a new, larger building. I wonder if they had heat pumps to tell us about. We'll find out. Thanks again, Paul, for joining us today. And everyone, give Paul a call and chat with him about heat pumps. All
Thanks,
right.
Kristen.
Thank you.